weeks ago, the European Commission launched a massive financial support plan to help the EU recover from the crisis. The idea is to finance this with new EU-level taxes, but the big question is whether there is sufficient political support to get the proposals through. Welcome to this 11th episode of IBFD's Tax Takes series of short videos on the global tax implications of the COVID-19 crisis. I'm Barry Larking, and I'm delighted and indeed honoured to have with me today one of the great names of international taxation and EU taxation, Professor Frans Vanistendael, who's speaking from Belgium, where his home is, and he is also the Emeritus Professor at the Catholic University in Leuven. Among the many impressive titles and functions that Professor Vanistendael has had over the years of his distinguished career, one of these is that he was for many years the academic chairman of the IBFD. So an ideal person to be speaking today about these EU tax-related COVID-19 issues. Professor, in a recent article, you described the EU's proposals, or the European Commission's proposals, as both remarkable, revolutionary and bold. Why?
Because the new proposals are revolutionary and bold, first of all, because of the volume, the size of the operation. So we are talking about 750 billion euros of loans and subsidies, and that's really a big amount. And overall, in the multi-annual financial framework for the EU budget, we are talking about 1,300 billion euros. So if you compare this with the annual budget of the European Union, which is 168 billion for 2020, we are talking about vast amounts of money.
Right. Is that the only thing, or are there other aspects?
No. So that's and basically what the aim of the Commission is. Right now, the size of the budget is about 1% of European GDP, and to up that, to increase that until 2% of GDP by the end of the multi-annual period. So that is a change. But the most important change, I think, is not only the size of the budget, because everyone is throwing money around. And compared to what the United States is throwing around, for instance, this is still modest. But also the nature of the financing is different. In the previous crisis, in the financial crisis, the intervention of the EU was always an intervention of loans to member states, which had to be repaid. So that means that the member state who received the loan should repay in the future that loan. Now we are talking not about loans, but we are talking about subsidies. Subsidies where the EU would borrow the money, because the EU as a whole is in a better place to borrow the money at better conditions than individual member states. And that money would be given for programs, of course, but would subsidize programs to recover from COVID-19.
And this has never been done before?
This has never been done before.
Right. And how's it going to be financed then? If these are grants rather than loans, the money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, well, that is the big problem. And I think that's also the sticking point, in the sense that to a certain extent, financing by subsidies and not by loans is more justified now than it was in the financial crisis. Because in the financial crisis, the root of the financial crisis was economic mismanagement by some member states. And so it was only normal that those member states would put their economy in order and then repay the loan. But this time it is a pandemic. So it is a health crisis, which results into an economic crisis. So that is not economic mismanagement by the member states in question. And so it is justified, also economically justified, to make that a subsidy.
Right, but again, going back to the key question,
yes.
it may be justified, but the money still has to come from somewhere.
Yeah. The problem is how to finance this. And therefore, we have to look into the mechanisms of financing the EU budget. Basically, the EU budget is financed by what is called own resources of the EU budget, but it is not own resources from the EU, because only 12% of that is customs import and export duties.
Those are EU level taxes.
The EU level taxes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the big chunk, the lion's share, is contributions, national contributions by the member states, calculated on the basis of their gross national income, GNI, which is the same as GDP, more or less. And so this is a real contribution from the national budget of the member states.
So one obvious possibility would be just to ask the member states to increase that contribution to finance it.
Well, that theoretically would be possible, but that is not at all realistic, because it would mean that the member states should increase their national taxes in order to repay European loans. Yeah. Well, try to sell that, because and of course, if they increase national taxes, the decision for that increase lies with the 27 national parliaments of the member states. I think that maybe some countries would be able to sell this proposition to their parliament, but I think certainly not all countries will follow that rule. So that is quite clearly that is excluded to increase national taxes at a time when most member states are decreasing their taxes in order to get the economy on its feet again.
So what you're saying is then the only option is for the EU to levy the taxes?
Yes, and that is exactly, and that's the second revolutionary thing in that in the proposal, it is clear that the EU itself now proposes to finance this financial gap, because it's quite clear that the normal budget of 168 billion a year will not be able to repay all those loans by 2057.
So what kind of taxes are they talking about?
And so the proposition also includes taxes, and not the traditional taxes like value-added tax and corporate income tax, etc., but it is mainly environmental levies. And that has to do with the rules with respect to the European budget. So environmental levies, border adjustment, CO2 border adjustment levies. And for border adjustment levies, of course, that has to do with cross-border trade of goods. Yeah. And that, of course, is the exclusive competence of the European Union. So the European Union is well placed to do that. They also want to extend the trade emission system to shipping, to navigation, and to aviation, to air flights. And
that all sounds fairly, I mean, you know, I think a lot of people would be in favor of that. It's all green policy. Not everybody, but some would. What about the controversial aspects too, or more controversial aspects?
There are two areas of proposal why the Commission is, because the Commission also proposes a Green Deal, so it's normal that the Commission also proposes EU taxes to finance this Green Deal, and at the same, because part of the program is also a climate change program. So it has not only to do with COVID-19, it is also a climate change program. So I think that is all justified. But the Commission also proposes to tax those companies that have made huge profits in COVID-19. And it also proposes to tax digital services, because we know, of course, that since a few years, digital services is an area in which the EU would like to introduce a common European tax. And so the Commission is using this proposition to promote that type of tax. Now,
and do you anticipate that we will get full support from the member states for, should we say, certainly these last two, the most controversial perhaps of the proposals?
I don't think so, because well, there is the well-known opposition of the what you call the frugal states, what I call the thrifty states.
Right.
And
that's we're talking about the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and Sweden, I think.
Yeah. And until now, until very recently, those states were not only backed by the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, of course, left, but now, of course, they were also backed by Germany. But the German government has apparently changed its position, and that, of course, is of enormous importance, because Germany is the biggest economic power within the EU. And as long as the biggest economic power, together with some other economic forces, is opposed to that, it will be very difficult. But apparently, the German government is wanting to change its position. And very important, the next 6 months, it is Germany that will have the presidency of the European Union. And so the thrifty states have been losing a very mighty ally.
So you sound fairly positive, I think, optimistic, I would call it, in terms of the prognosis at the moment. But what about the US? We know that the US is not very happy about digital service taxes. It's threatening to impose tariffs on French champagne and handbags. We know that they're investigating a whole load of digital service taxes outside the United States on the basis that they are contrary to international law. Can we be realistic and expect the EU to push through these proposals given the opposition from the US and the threat of tariff wars?
Well, the thing is that the German presidency will be overlapping the US elections, because the German presidency will end the end of this year, and the US elections will take place early November.
Yeah.
And that, of course, will be of crucial importance, in the sense that if there is a change in majority in the United States, then I think it would be possible to arrive to a compromise somewhere. If that's not the case, then I think it's very simple. The EU will have to choose, and it may choose, saying, for temporarily, for not imposing a digital services tax as a way of financing the EU budget. But the multi-annual framework runs until 2027, and that is even further than a second term for President Trump. So it is not impossible that the EU may change a road in the middle of the term, so how that works out, to me, that's not so important. As a matter of principle, decides to go for green taxes, even if it's not a digital tax, it is a revolution.
Right, and of course, on the digital tax, that is all dependent on the outcome of the OECD and inclusive framework proposals in relation to Pillar 1. If Pillar 1 goes through, the theory is that the digital service taxes will be. But I guess then Pillar 1 may well be an alternative to the digital service tax proposal from the European Commission. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time, but I've just got one more question to you, and that is, if Paolo Gentiloni were to ring you up tomorrow and say, what is your best piece of advice in terms of getting the EU back on its feet after the COVID-19 crisis, what would be your response to that?
There would be double response, a short-term response and a long-term response. The short-term response would be that the Commission, and of course, as a Commissioner, Mr. Gentiloni can only support the proposal by the Commission. So strong support for the proposal by the Commission. But then there is another challenge, and that is the challenge of how to tax multinationals in the European Union. And in my view, that is a real challenge, because I'm convinced that the fundamental freedoms and the European treaties and the fundamental freedoms cannot be applied simultaneously on incoming movements and outgoing movements in the EU by multinationals. Because outgoing movement and incoming movements require capital export neutrality or capital import neutrality, and you cannot have capital export neutrality and capital import neutrality within the same single corporate tax system.
Right, I understand. So, I mean, what you're saying is effectively he's got to look at EU law and also the economics behind it in determining the policy going forward. Well, I think that's a great point to finish on. And I would thank you very much indeed, Professor Vanistendael, for giving us the benefit of your insights during this extremely short time period that we've got for this video. Thank you once again. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. If you'd like to see more of the IBFD Tax Takes videos, please check out the IBFD website. And thank you once again.
Thank you. My pleasure.